Hello and welcome back. In this particular part of our tutorial, we'll talk about different logging techniques that we could implement with Hibernate Reactive and Eclipse Vert.x. So without further ado, let's run any of tests that we have implemented so far. For example, this one, find tasks by user test, is an excellent candidate. So let's execute it. And here, if we will analyze our console, we have a lot of different scary red messages. However, none of them actually belong to Hibernate Reactive. For example, our first lines here that we have in our output, actually what is called Vertx logging. So logging that is done by different Vertx component, in particular Vertx core and Vertx launcher. Also, we have different warnings that come from Netty, and this is called a server logging. So logging that is done by a Netty web server. Only here we have different messages that actually about Hibernate Reactive, and this is what is the subject of this particular tutorial. Also, in the end of our output, we have different messages that's done by application itself, so by our business logic. This is what is called application level or just application logging. So without further ado, let's check how we could set up logging for Hibernate Reactive and Vertx. So far so good. So let's briefly talk about some theoretical aspects. In the Hibernate Reactive documentation, in the section that is called 1.2.2 optional dependencies, you could see a table with different optional dependencies that you could add to your project. And Hibernate basically works as a facade, so you don't need to do manual configuration, and you just need to do high-level configuration of these components, and Hibernate will do any low-level work for us. Especially in this particular section, I'm interested in the first line here, which is an SL4J logging implementation, and you could add either log4j from Apache here or SL4J logging implementation. Doesn't matter, because Hibernate will do all low-level configuration for us. And what we will do, we will scroll down to the section 1.2.5 logging the generated SQL. What we will do, we just need to specify very high-level configuration for logging. So what we want to see in our output. In particular, because Hibernate is an ORM framework and we do not write any SQL code, we could output SQL code that is generated by Hibernate for us. And we will talk about later on in this tutorial about these things. But for now, let's jump to Vertx documentation, because in this tutorial, in the previous subsection, I talked about Vertx logging. And you see here in Vertx core documentation, there is a dedicated section on logging. Basically, logging in Vertx is configured automatically, and you don't need to do any kind of manual configuration in most cases. What you just need to do is to provide a suitable logging library in your class path, and different supported implementations are provided in the documentation, and you could see also log4j and SL4j in the list. Finally, I would like to talk about Netty logging, because we already talked about server logging, so logging that is done by Netty library itself. Again, Netty does not rely on any external logging configuration, and it is also configured automatically. And in most cases, this setup is good for most use cases. However, we could do manual logging setup for Netty, but is outside of the scope of this tutorial. But again, what you need to do is just to provide a suitable logging library in the class path. So this is how we could configure things. And without further ado, let's go to Maven repository, and let's look for log4j core library. So here, this first one, Apache log4j core, let's select it, and specifically with logging libraries for Java, you need to select the last one, because there was a very big vulnerability in the past, and you could see that all these old versions of log4j are basically not suitable for production. So select the latest one, which is 2.19 as the time of the recording of this tutorial. So let's copy and let's go to our IDE and let's go to pom.xml and let's add this dependency. And don't forget to sync your pom.xml. So the first and by far the simplest way to configure logging in Hibernate is by using properties. So in the setup method of our test where we configure different properties, we could add properties that actually are responsible for logging. And the first one is called show SQL. So let's add another line of code with Hibernate props, and we put here another record which is called Hibernate show SQL. And basically this property accepts Boolean values, so either true or false. By default it's false and we add the true value. So let's go back and let's run the test that we ran in the previous subsection. And now when we see output, it will be different because instead of all red lines of code that belong to Hibernate, we have here configured Hibernate logging. So you see here that we have different messages, especially we see here insert statement, create statement, different SQL statements actually that are generated by Hibernate. It is very important to see that here we don't see actual values that are binded later on to Hibernate SQL statements. Later on we will see how to do it, how to actually output bindings. For now we will not talk about it, just to see that this is how we could configure logging. Other important methods that you could use and you configure with properties is called actually format SQL. So say Hibernate format SQL, and again it accepts a Boolean value. So let's go back and let's run this test again. So now in the output you see more human-friendly, more formatted SQL code. So instead of one line of each statement, you could see this output. So this is a way to make a logging statements of Hibernate a little bit more readable, especially if you have a lot of different logging lines in your output and you want to find them. So as you see here, what we do in this particular configuration, we configure a higher level logging. So what we do here, we specify logging for Hibernate, not for particular logging library, and this is logging that we could configure once, and we could then change to SL4J library and it will work. However, I would like to talk about a more customized approach that actually requires to do what is called library-specific configuration. Okay, so this implementation is very high level. It is quite simple to set up, so we just need to add several properties to our configuration. However, the problem here is that it's not very flexible, it's not very customized, and when we need to do more precise logging, when we want to specify, for example, login level, or we specify various components that we want to add to our logging, like binding or statistics, we could not do it using properties and configuration. Instead, what we need to do, we need to have a more precise log4j logging, which is more low level configuration, because it affects actually particular implementation. And let's see how we could do it. Let's comment out these two lines of code that we add so far. And here inside the source folder, let's create a resource folder if you don't have it, so we call it resources. And let's create inside these resources a new file that is called log4j2.properties. So it will be also a properties file. So what we'll do here, we could also configure logging by using properties. So let's say a logger, Hibernate name, and this property is basically specify a name of component that is used for logging. In our case, to provide the same stuff that we did so far with show SQL, we need to use org. Hibernate SQL. And now what we could do, we could specify a level of logging that we want to use. In particular, let's use a debug one. So the logger Hibernate level, and let's use debug level. So now if we go and if we will run this test again, but with this log4j properties logging configuration, you see that the output is slightly different. The first thing first, you could see that we now have a time, we have a name of the thread, we also have a level that we specify as the debug, we specify a name of a component, which is org Hibernate SQL, and then we have same logging statements that we already saw when we just use show SQL property. So the same thing, however, we will get more information. And using this approach with tweaking of particular logging library is more customized, as we will see. So now what I'd like to do, I would like to see how we could add here in this insert statements, how we could actually add this binded value. So let's see how we could do it. So let's add another logger to our configuration, and this logger would be called binder. And the components that we will use for this particular logger would be org Hibernate .type .descriptor .sql, and here we have the first one, basic binder. This is a component that we actually need. So let's specify a level, a logging level for this particular component. We will use a trace level, so say logger binder level, and we use a trace level. So let's run our test again, and now if we will see our output, it will be much more lines, because actually Hibernate will provide us a binding parameter. So let's see as an example the first insert statement, which inserts a first record inside the tasks table. So we have here completed value, we have a content, created at, user ID, and finally the ID. And here we have the value number 1, value number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. And what we could see in the previous lines for this output statement, we have actually binding parameters with the number of 1, of 2, 3, and 4, 4 and 5 that are inserted in this SQL statement. So the first one is a completed value, it is a false. The second one is a content, it's my task. The third one is the date and time of a creation, and you see that the type here is a timestamp. So on the Java code, sorry, we use a local date time. However, for PostgreSQL, it is a timestamp data type. And we have two integers. The first one is a user ID, is 1, and the second one, integer value, is actually a generated ID. So the last thing that I would like to talk about in this tutorial is how we could include performance metrics, performance statistics in our logging output. So first thing first, let's create another logger, and we'll call it stats. And the components that we will use for this logger is called org.hibernate.engine.internal, and the components is this one, the statistical logging session event listener. And let's specify a level. So the level that we use for stats logger also would be a trace. However, this is not all configuration. Let's go back to the setup method, and we need to add another property, and we need to tell to Hibernate to actually generate statistics. So we add the Hibernate props that is called generate statistics, and we set it to true. Let's now run this test again. And you could see that between statements from SQL and from basic binder, now we have this statistical logging session event listener that provide us with the session metrics, such as a number of connections, statements, and actual time that is spent by Hibernate to complete operations. However, as we just scratched the surface of logging with Hibernate Reactive and Eclipse Vert.x throughout this tutorial, I highly recommend you to avoid, not only recommend, but it's actually a requirement to avoid all sensitive data in the logging output. For example, here we have bindings of values, and these values, for example, here we have a user ID number for this one. So we need to avoid any sensitive user data in our logging output because it could be easily compromised. For more information about logging patterns and logging techniques with Eclipse Vert.x, I highly suggest you to check my book Principles of Vertx second edition, and the link for this book is provided in the description for this tutorial.